You know, having a debate about the definition of veganism is not a useful thing particularly. We need to talk about the philosophy of veganism and its kind of expansive meaning. And so we need to move beyond just the definition. I mean, the definition of any big idea doesn't really capture the idea. I mean, I made the point in a YouTube video many moons ago that if you look at most modern day definitions, internet definitions of a big idea, then they're all full of internet hyperlinks to point out the fact that, well, this is the basic idea, but there's a lot more to it than that. And that's the same with the movement. There is a basic focus, but there's a lot more to it. And the more to it is kind of prone-sectional, intertwining, kind of entanglements kind of idea, the David Nybert type idea, that oppression and liberation are entangled. And if we appreciate that, then we can move forward in terms of alliances without losing our focus. That's not even on the table. That nobody's saying we should change the focus, but we shouldn't lose the scope. That's my view.
We are at the 2 hour mark. There are still about 40 people here. So, I mean, the whole idea is to create a space to share ideas. So if you do want to stick around, you're most welcome to. Please do X in the chat if there's any thoughts that you'd like to wrap things up with. I personally find some of the thoughts at the end are some of the best. The link being dropped into the chat around David Nybert's book, we can link that in the event afterwards. That is one I'd recommend as well, just for understanding these things. I know the focus and scope framing has really helped me for how to approach these issues. That doesn't need to be a competition. And maybe we could design a whole session, Roger. What do you think about a whole session around what that scope actually means, around being a involved ally to human rights issues versus a supportive ally and the rest of it, and what all that kind of means, especially in the light of recent developments?
Well, we could do. I mean, we could talk about the difference between intersectionality and pro-intersectionality, all that kind of thing. But in some ways, focus and scope is so simple, it shouldn't really need to be debated for any length of time, and it's not difficult to understand. It's just that most social movements have a focus, but it's the scope of it in terms of its interest in justice, non-violence, liberation, all those kind of things are wider. And so therefore, if there are other progressive movements around with the same values, they're our natural allies, which is, going back to what Irina said, there is this movement is almost like naturally left-leaning. Now, some people could say left-wing, some people could say far left. People like Steve Best would kind of have that as a broad kind of left thing. He goes from anarchists and communists through to kind of left-leaning liberals and stuff, and he is quite happy to kind of regard them as left-leaning. But there's certainly, in terms of our values, we've got a left-leaning movement, but this movement is under attack at the moment by some right-wing people coming into it and trying to redefine the movement. So we've got the food activists, the Tobias Leonhardt, who wants to introduce animal products into veganism and say that, it's okay to have exceptions now and again. And then now you've got the animals only people. They're trying to make the focus the scope, whereas there is a focus and a scope.
So it does look like we have some X's coming through. Ollie, I believe, if I'm not wrong, you are the first up. Let me just find you here.
He's already unmuted.
Yep.
I think what's quite interesting is recently there was the Hunt Saboteur Association. They made a post about establishing or saying, okay, so the anti-fascist roots of the Hunt Saboteurs. So I think that's really interesting because a lot of comments on there were quite negative. There was a lot of people on there commenting saying, why don't you just stick to foxes? Why do you have to leave? Why can't you leave politics out of this, etc., etc.? And then there was a lot of people biting back at that, saying, well, a lot of you haven't ever been in a SAB van, and it really shows in a Landy, which I think is quite interesting because there's a lot of people that are sort of, how do I put this, kind of on the outside. They might be vegan, but they're on the outside, let's say, of the movement, looking in, kind of thing. So they pipe up every now and again. And I think that it's the majority of those people are the ones which have the social media accounts. There's one person I can think of in particular. I won't name him just because it's not needed. But anyway, there's a few people that are more sort of on the right, and they make posts saying stuff about sort of saying, oh, this movement isn't left leaning, and etc. etc. But I think when you actually get really involved with these different groups, especially the hunt saboteurs, most of the hunt saboteurs which I've met have always been on the left, because it is a left thing. Because, well, you know, you're not going to be voting Conservative and be a hunt saboteur, because, you know, doesn't make sense. It's better when groups are more straightforward and they say, yes, we are left leaning, like the Hunt Saboteurs Association did. And most people who are involved will say, yeah, that's cool. It's when people like Anonymous for the Voiceless kind of, well, they've kind of let themselves know what they stand for by going silent on a lot of issues. But anyway, despite that, when they don't state, or they say, oh, we're neutral, I think it puts a lot of people off, because it's like, why would you want to stay neutral on something which is ultimately, you know, the right thing to do?
I think in terms of sort of left and right, it's important to remember that that there are two spectrums of left and right. One is the social spectrum and one is the economic spectrum. And like for instance, a lot of people, you know, obviously think of Hitler as a right wing, and socially Hitler was very right wing, but economically he is actually in the centre. So we kind of need to understand that there are these two spectrums, and on both of those spectrums, our movement has to be left wing. If you look at the social spectrum, like for instance, we have to be opposed to racism. We have to be opposed to homophobia, sexism, because if we're not opposed to those things, it doesn't make it logical to be opposed to speciesism. You can't argue against speciesism from a rational position if you're a racist or a sexist or a homophobe. It just doesn't make sense. So we have to be, from that point of view, apart from those other forms of oppression being appalling in themselves, just from the point of view of being able to argue for animal liberation and have a rational foundation for our position, we have to be opposed to those other forms of oppression and prejudice. And with regard to the economic left, we have to be left-wing economically as well. We're never going to achieve animal liberation under capitalism. And the reason for that is because, you know, capitalism drives materialism, it drives consumerism, it drives the destruction of the natural world, which is a huge area of animal oppression. And so, you know, for the sake of animal liberation, we have to be opposed to capitalism. The other reason is because at the moment, it's interesting that there's kind of all this concern about the economy, you know, that there's been this kind of reduction in the economy and everyone's kind of upset about that. And we have to get people back to work, we have to get people out there, we have to get people in the shops to grow the economy. We don't want to grow the economy. We need to shrink the economy. We need degrowth. We need to stop taking stuff from the natural world, because everything we take from the natural world that we don't absolutely need for our well-being and survival causes the suffering and death of other animals quite unjustifiably. We have to have degrowth. But if you're going to have degrowth, if you're going to have less stuff for everyone, you've got to have redistribution of wealth. Otherwise, what's happened is that the rich will be all right because they can easily lose half their stuff and they'll be okay. But the poor are going to like really suffer. So if you're going to have degrowth to actually bring about animal liberation, you've got to have redistribution of wealth, and you've got to have some kind of socialist system or either eco-socialism or green anarchism. We have to have some, one of those type of systems, which actually, in actual fact, are very similar, as the political and economic system of our world. Otherwise, we're not going to get animal liberation, and otherwise, the poorer people in our world are going to suffer.